First up, a question is about the OFSC requirements for subcontractors in terms of communication between the PC on the requirements of mobile plants, so 16.3, 16.9 and all the rest of those. What requirements do the subcontractors have in terms of communication with the PC, Brett?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, there's no specific requirement for communication around mobile plant requirements. Obviously, there'll be a general duty to communicate with your with PCBUs on your project, but none of the specific H16 criteria address specifically communication requirements. So when I'm talking about those things, it's more about these are the companies or the companies who are successful in these criteria that they do very well. Obviously, the communication is a critical part of execution and getting it right. But there's no specific requirement under the FSC criteria to specifically communicate mobile plant requirements. I think it would be very difficult for a company and contractors to comply without some formal type of communication, which would be encouraged, particularly through the criteria. I think it's FP 4.1, where we're communicating with the contractor around sharing our safety plan and/or project risk assessment, which would include some requirements for what the company would expect around mobile plant. And a lot of companies and most companies in the scheme would have a tender briefing or a pre-start meeting with a contractor prior to execution, which is also a good time to communicate that information.
Thanks, Brett. And Richie, did you have anything to add on how you deal with subcontractors and communicating the requirements of the scheme?
Well, fairly consistent with Brett's explanation, of course. The subcontractors bear no liability for the principal contractor not adhering to the requirements of OFSC under the accreditation scheme. Albeit we have a legal obligation to make sure that we communicate, collaborate and coordinate with the subcontractors. So I think Brett's stated that quite clearly.
Excellent, thank you. We have one question here regarding the air quality control in the tunnel. Richie, one of those early things you mentioned about where does the contaminated air end up going? Is it vented into the atmosphere or is it controlled, and what are the processes for that?
Well, it goes through scrubbers, and the scrubbers obviously clean and purify the air, and it can be recirculated back into the tunnel, of course. But the example I gave of the Bradis initiative enables us to isolate and create certain zones within the tunnel, which from a ventilation design perspective makes it far more simpler to maintain clean air to the workforce through the tunnel.
Excellent. And Brett, do we have any specific information on how we're supposed to manage that under the scheme? Is there any specific requirement there?
Well, under criteria WH14, the personal exposure monitoring and health surveillance criteria, obviously there's some management for control of dust that would come under that criteria if you specifically had that. But obviously we've got some risk associated with the work. Obviously in a tunnel there's specific criteria around that, but also it could be interpreted by an auditor quite within the criteria that to look at that general, point one of all the hazards around that being a hazard. Obviously, there's personal exposure versus environmental exposure, and that control is subtly different around those things. So we're controlling the atmosphere rather than the personal part. And obviously not just limited to dust, I imagine, Richie. I imagine that's a control, obviously, for other contaminants such as diesel particulate and others within the tunnel cavern as well. So that's some great initiatives by you guys.
One more for Richie. The pile caps. There's a question here about how they were attached to the chains and what the process is for that.
Yes, I don't know if that's clearly depicted in the illustration on the slide, but they're removed via the use of lifting lugs, which are cast into the top of the concrete pile.
The mechanical arm for the concrete testing, where was that created and how was that created, and where can people look into something similar?
Yeah, so that was developed by the joint venture team out in the WestConnex 3A project, which was actually the Acciona Samsung Bouygues joint venture, known as the ASB JV. In collaboration with Hanson, I believe, we're also involved in the development of that particular initiative. So certainly a credit to the joint venture team out there, in particular Andrew Marcinet and the PD and Manuel Klesch, the D&C director, and their full team out there. So it's quite a simple but certainly a clever initiative.
Brett, over to you. Can we confirm, someone's asked if the OEM plant risk assessment is the gold standard and would only need to be amended or redone in the event of a modification?
not all OEMs supply plant risk assessments. It's a little bit hit and miss, and some of those OEM, particularly on the age of the plant, some of them I've seen them as old as 25, 30 years old. So obviously there's obviously a currency requirement around some of those things. Whether it's the gold standard or not would depend on whether the OEMs actually complied with the things that I spoke about. OEMs get it wrong as well. But they are a good standard, obviously. Getting the OEM to do the plant risk assessment rather than the contractors is a very sensible and prudent way to approach it. The second part of the question around if we make any modifications to the plant or we add any attachments or things like that, yep, 100% correct. The plant risk assessment would need to be reviewed if we were going to make a change to the inherent conditions of the plant or we're going to use it in a different way. So that, yes, that answers yes to that part.
For mobile cranes, do they get treated as stationary machines like a tower crane after it's been set up and is no longer mobile, or what's the differentiation there?
I've never looked at it that way, but that's a great question. No, it'll still be treated as mobile plant. I've realised that it is mobile cranes are set up and then used, as are concrete pumps, which are treated like mobile plant as well. So obviously they are mobile in that jurisdiction, but it's certainly an interesting interpretation that when they are actually in use, they are stationary. So it's the ability for the machine to be propelled rather than it being propelled as the part of the time of the audit. But I like whoever asked that question. I like their style. That's a great question. So yes, they would be considered mobile plants still once they are set up and operational. Regarding
the OFSC's position on major inspection requirements for registered cranes, is it at 10 years or is it based on a usage assessment, or how does that work?
Yeah, we would interpret that as a 10-year thing. Obviously, during COVID, there was a lot of relaxations, and you can still get a relaxation if there's certain reasons about why a crane may or may not have had its 10-year inspection. But we would nominally approach that unless there was something very specific about that particular crane that meant that wasn't required. But certainly that would be the rule of thumb applied by the FSO.
Richie, we've got one question here, sort of in the space of the mechanical arm discussion about whether any sort of investigation or research has been done in using drones to do that instead of mechanical arm. Do you know, aware of anything like that, or have Bouygues looked into something relating to drones in that space?
We haven't investigated utilising drones for that particular application, but look, these things are possible. Obviously, technologies are quickly evolving at such a rapid pace. I mean, we're seeing things like AI and other technologies starting to be deployed, not just in our sector, but more broadly across a range of industry sectors. So look, it's possible. Have we studied it? No. Possibility we could look at these things in the future.
A bit of a statement question here, Brett, about the code of practice indicating the assessment of the risk may not be necessary if dealing with a known risk with known controls. I'm not sure if you saw that question, where they can't be designed out or recorded by designers and manufacturers and addressed in the OEM, which is supplied with the plant item. I'm not sure if that's much of a question or much of a statement. Is there anything to add for that?
No, that does exist within the code of practice, and it doesn't often get applied. So I didn't really raise it. I was trying to sort of deal with the more common matters that we are addressed with. Where there's a specific type of plant that might be unusual or otherwise, that where we might apply that definition, or I probably need to understand some specificity about the question. But certainly there are areas where that's applied, where there's uniqueness around that plant risk assessment requirement. Obviously, if we're going to be using a piece of mobile plant on a project, we need to understand the inherent risks associated with, so we can incorporate them into the safe system of work. So the auditor would have to work with the company around actually understanding what their process was to manage those two aspects.
Excavator quick hitches. Safe Work New South Wales apparently on January 1 prohibiting the use of hitches with the detach prevention only. What are the OFSC's requirements in relation to that?
So primarily we would follow criteria is number one, and then the local jurisdiction requirements. So when we're auditing in New South Wales, we'd apply those guidelines. So we would do that. New South Wales specific guidelines wouldn't be applied to other jurisdictions, obviously, because it's not an FSC criteria. It's a local jurisdictional thing. But obviously accredited companies who are operating in New South Wales would have to think about whether they incorporated that aspect into their documented system process, if that makes sense. So we would apply local jurisdiction requirements in New South Wales, but companies who do work in New South Wales, if we were auditing in, say, Victoria or Queensland or otherwise, we would seek that their system would incorporate those matters for when they're doing work in that particular jurisdiction.
Cool. All right. Well, we might have to end it there. Richie, Brett, did you guys have anything else you wanted to add?
Just again to quickly thank each of our teams in the Cross Yarra Partnership and the Melbourne Metro, and in particular the WestConnex 3A joint venture, or project rather, in ASB JV. Yeah, just thanks to everybody there leading the way and really setting the tone in terms of our safety standards, and certainly forging forward in terms of the application of new technology and innovation. So thanks for all your individual efforts. The initiatives we're presented as a company, we're certainly not rusted on to those particular innovations. There's many others out there and there's many other providers. So yeah, just probably implore each of you to go away and do your research. And there's plenty of players in the space, plenty of vendors that are offering really smart solutions. So plenty of opportunity there.
As I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the session, this will be up online within the next week or so at fsc.gov.au. And like Brett said, if you have any additional questions or any questions that were unanswered, please send them to ofsc@dewr.gov.au. Reminder to follow us at the OFSC on LinkedIn. It's a great way to stay up to date with all our latest news, events, and you'll see the next webinars. Our next webinar we're looking to hold in mid to late June. Invites will be sent out if you were on the invitation list. If you weren't on the list, please send a request through to ofsc@dewr.gov.au. Thank you very much again for joining us.